It's the greatest mystery in literary history. A divisive question with highly contested answers. Who was the writer behind the pen name William Shakespeare? Welcome to Don't Quill the Messenger. Here's your host, Stephen Sable.
Welcome back, fellow Quillers. I have a treat for you for this episode. He is author Derek Hunter. His book, Anonymous Agnostic Antichrists, explores the Sackville theory of authorship. And I'll let Derek talk to us more about that as we get into the program. But it also delves a lot into the idea of collaborative work, that the Shakespeare brand became a brand that was used by multiple writers, Sackville being sort of the leader or head honcho of the deal. Derek, welcome to Don't Quill the Messenger.
Hey, nice to be here. Thank you so much, Stephen. I really appreciate you, taking the time to read the book and to have me on here, and I'm very excited to be here.
Well, before we begin talking about the book, the big mystery, of course, and everybody who loves this series is, I call them super sleuths. We all love a great mystery, but this book has very mysterious origins, and you have an intro in the beginning, sort of a preface that talks about some of the mystique that surrounds, sort of an editorial note, sort of talks about the mystique that surrounds this manuscript you received that you based the book upon. Can we start there? Can we talk a little bit about how that happened, what that exchange was like from this anonymous contributor? And that's what led to the writing of the book, right?
Yes. Well, I should explain something. So I've been obsessed with Shakespeare since a teenager, so the last 30 years. And a year after I fell in love with Shakespeare's work, I also fell in love with the Shakespeare authorship question. So it's something that I've been researching and enjoying for the last 30 years. I've looked into, I believe, all of the different theories. I've even created some of my own. But I made a decision as a teenager to write the true story. Like, what was the true story? Who was the true author of the plays and poetry with Shakespeare's name on them? So I made a promise to myself, and over the years, I changed my mind many times. I'm still currently agnostic. I still feel that it hasn't been solved. I still think it's a mystery. But I spent a lot of time on the Oxfordian theory and loved De Vere for many years, and the Marlovian theory was dedicated to Christopher Marlowe. And to others too, Henry Neville, William Stanley, the Sixth Earl of Derby. So there's been many others, and also Thomas North. There's been many others, and I've again created my own theories. But again, what's really important to know is the first thing people should know is this is a work of fiction. And so I am primarily a writer of fiction. I have written some nonfiction works, but what I used is a literary device which started with probably maybe the greatest novel of all time, which is Don Quixote. And it was a device that Cervantes used, or if it wasn't Cervantes, perhaps someone else. They used a device of illusion by basically making up this story that they found this manuscript written by somebody else, and they did a little bit of rewriting. Now, we don't know for sure. Maybe Cervantes was telling us the truth, or maybe he was not. But it's a device that has been used by authors over the centuries. There was a recent example, one of my favorite current authors, he's no longer around, but he died recently, is Aleister Gray. Aleister Gray was a Scottish author who wrote books like Lanark in 1982, Janine, and then also wrote a book called Poor Things. Poor Things was recently turned into a fantastic film. I loved it. In 2023 by the Greek filmmaker Yorgos Lanthimos, starring Emma Stone, of course, won a number of awards for that, and it's a great film. And it's based on Aleister Gray's book. In that novel, it's very different from the film in that it plays with truth. in terms of the narrative, in terms of who's telling the truth. So there's various different narratives in the book of Poor Things, and they had very different perceptions on what actually happened. I'm very interested in this, and it's a very important aspect to the Shakespeare authorship question, because if it wasn't Shakespeare, the person who was behind these works was very interested in illusion, in deception, and they were not wanting the truth to be told, or they were maybe hiding in plain sight. Who knows? But this sort of idea was something that really struck me, and I really wanted to play with this in terms of authenticity and deception, genuine, truth versus lies, and what's hidden behind the mask. So I did it as a writer with this literary device. So that actually never happened. Like, I just made that up. I did that as a playful thing, letting the very similar to what Aleister Gray did in Poor Things, and also what I believe is also true of Cervantes in Don Quixote as well, and many other authors between the two.
Now, see, I wish that you hadn't told me that. I wish that you could have kept that a secret, because it's a very intriguing premise, right? And it makes the book more mysterious. And I wish that the listeners didn't know that now, so that they could read the book. Maybe there should have been something at the very end of the book that says, P.S. This was part of my, literary device. And this manuscript doesn't really exist, because I didn't realize that. I didn't know that. And in reading the book, and, I want to talk about some of the aspects of the book that intrigued me the most. And one of them is this first person narrative, that it comes from the voice of Sackville himself, sort of telling his life story and his version of events. And I found myself, as I was reading the book, thinking, wow, was all of this stuff in this manuscript? This was sort of his like personal diary that Derek got a hold of, and so then transferred that into this book? Now it makes sense, because there were times when I'm reading it and I went, well, that sounds very modern, the language, the style.
Yes.
And I thought, well, that can't have been part of some manuscript written in the 16th century, because the vernacular isn't correct, and the terms and the terminology wouldn't have been used then that are being used in the book. And now I understand why.
Well, it's definitely, what in the introduction, I do mention that. I said that I basically, not necessarily translated, but I rewrote the manuscript in modern language to help the readers be able to enjoy the story. So that was actually part of the illusion. Actually, I was explaining that at the beginning in the introduction, letting people know that the wording, the language was rewritten by me in modern English. But also too, so as you know, the Sackville novel is the first of four. So there's four novels. So there's four novels with four different points of view on who wrote the Shakespeare authorship question. So there's a Thomas Watson novel called The Lover. So that's book 2 of Anonymous Agnostic Antichrists. There's book 3, which is called The Youth. And that is about John Ford coming in much, much later and rewriting them and turning them into masterpieces. Thomas Watson's story is more about his death, is the reason for why he used the Shakespeare name. Then the last one is Amelia Lanier's story, and that's the Dark Lady and her being a woman having to take on the Shakespeare name. So in all four of these novels, at the very beginning, I put in there, what you read in the last novel was not true. And I found a new manuscript and met with new people who told me that this is the true one. And it repeats and it repeats and repeats. So all four times, the very beginning, they're all claiming to be the truth. So there's four different manuscripts that claim to be the truth.
Well, I happen to believe that historical fiction is the way that we're going to move the needle on this topic. I think historical fiction has, for the longest time, been one of the most popular genres. It's experiencing a wonderful resurgence right now in the world of especially with all these big studios who make serials now, like Netflix series and Amazon series and Hulu series, etc. And I think that this particular book, this first one, with the Sackville point of view, I think would make a great series because of the way that you break it up into these chapters that discuss his interactions with so many of these other writers who probably did play some sort of a part in creating the Shakespeare canon. And I think in that sense, you hit it very strongly, this collaboration that was going on between writers during that period to make this canon happen.
Yes, thank you for saying that. I really appreciate that because it definitely, I was writing it, having been a filmmaker when I was younger and an actor myself, so I've made films, shorts and in a feature film. So my brain works in a very kind of cinematic way where I like to see the scenes play out. And so in a lot of ways, I was thinking of this writing when I was writing this book. I was writing all my stories in very cinematic terms, in terms of how does this scene play out, between these two actors, or, the scene and the visuals. So definitely, I would love it to happen. It would be great, and certainly, I agree with you too. I think it helps to have all these it's got an enormous cast. It's got a huge cast, from Ben Jonson to Richard Barnfield to Christopher Marlowe to Thomas Kidd to Thomas Watson to Edward Dyer to Thomas Middleton, to just like a long range of people that just populate the story. And it is true that while it is a work of fiction, there's an enormous amount of research that went into this book and the other ones too. And so I, really wanted to invest it with actual truth, like what we know about these people from various different sources. And it was an exciting time. I think that's the thing. It's one of the things I think is unfortunate about Shakespeare, is that he is such this enormous figure that he cast this enormous shadow over everyone else that was doing things at the time. And it was a really glorious period, a highly, highly productive, creative period for a lot of different people. There's an enormous amount of authors writing really fascinating works at that time.
I had a recent episode with Professor Jessica Winston about the writers of the 1560s and how much they changed the landscape of English literature. And we touched a little bit on the 1590s and how, here it was 30 years later, and the fruits, sort of this like cyclical nature of this explosion of literature that occurred between the 60s and the 90s. And the 90s isn't her specialty, as she said in the episode, but we did talk about the comparison there between those particular decades where so much was happening. And I think you're right. The difference between studying like what was happening in the 60s, which would include Sackville, by the way,
yes,
as one of the sort of the founding fathers of English literature, with especially with Gorboduc, for instance, as sort of like the first play of its type, right? Like, and we build on that foundation, and then in the 90s, boom, it just explodes. But you're right, suddenly this name William Shakespeare comes to the forefront in like further historical study. And the rest of those guys that you just mentioned, Lilly, Dyer, North, they all sort of fall to the wayside underneath that shadow. And one of the things that you do in your book is you sort of bring them all into the light, one chapter at a time. And that's where I found myself seeing it and going, that's what would make it a great series, because each episode could be about the author character, even if it's not Sackville. Whoever, insert anyone. You could almost insert anyone. You could insert Shakespeare of Stratford in there if you wanted to, because it is, historical fiction. But you could have each episode about his interactions with each of those literary figures and how that played a part in creating the Shakespeare canon, and would make a fabulous series, I think.
Definitely. I think it was definitely a multi-generational endeavor. I mean, really think this, if you look at from the 1560s all the way through to when the theaters are closed down in 1641, I believe, that whole period was like 80-year period in England, where just like from the court plays that you have, which, Gorbaduc, I think I think we have that because someone decided to go ahead and print that without Sackville's permission, by the way, while he was away in Italy. And so someone just went ahead and printed that. But that's just like one example. We just so happened to have that one because someone decided to print that one. But we know for a fact that there was, for example, a play of Romeo and Juliet that was performed and that was highly regarded, and that there was a play of Julius Caesar around that time and many others in the 1560s. So you have this period of where these people were writing plays for the court, and it must have been quite an exciting time, but it wasn't until the late 1570s that we have the public theaters open. And then from the late 1570s, then you roll over into the 1580s, and then that's the real explosion of a lot of the theaters were really booming in the 1580s. It was another exciting decade, and that then led into, like what you mentioned, the 1590s, which then it just became this brilliant, beautiful thing that it was. And but a lot of that was because a lot of the plays were actually being printed finally too. There was the thing, because of Spencer, mostly because of Spencer and Lilly, and also Robert Greene. Those were the three main ones that decided to put their name to their works, and that was something that just simply wasn't done. Certainly wasn't done for Sackville. Sackville and his generation, him and De Vere, and also Sydney. Sydney didn't publish anything until after he died. It was his sister who published his work after his death. So, Dyer, we don't even know.
And if memory serves me correctly, didn't Mary Sidney, wasn't she the first writer of what basically became Antony and Cleopatra? Didn't she wrote a play on the life of Mark Antony, or translated a piece on the life of Mark Antony that later becomes Antony and Cleopatra?
Well, okay, yeah. So that's so she did. She definitely did, and she wrote. It was what is called a closet drama, though. So it was definitely not written for the public stage. So it's very important for people to understand there was a very strong distinction in those days between the acceptable form of publication of a play, which was these closet dramas. And so a really good example of that, why that is so, is Thomas Kyd. So Thomas Kyd wrote, he wrote the Spanish tragedy, but it was during the whole time, it was the most popular play during the period, by the way. No other play was performed more often than the Spanish tragedy. The Spanish tragedy never had an author's name attached to it. Never, not once. And the first publication in 1592, it didn't have an author's name. It was anonymous. And it wasn't until, I think was Thomas Heywood in 1612, an apology for actors, I believe it was, that he said, "Oh yeah, by the way, Thomas Kyd, he's the author of the Spanish tragedy." Now, there's this lack of wanting to put one's name to theater, like public theater plays, but he was very willing to publish his name on the this play that he wrote, which was was like a Senecan. It was based on Corneille's play. I'm forgetting the name of it, but it was published in the year that he died in 1594, and it had his name attached to it. For Mary Sidney, yes, she did. She wrote a play, Antony and Cleopatra. It's quite different from the one that we know with Shakespeare's name on it. Even Fulk Greville, he claimed to have written a Antony and Cleopatra play as well, but he burned it for fear of the authorities getting him into trouble. He wrote a closet drama version of it. So it is very clear that the Shakespeare Antony and Cleopatra, it was again, it was a public theater publication, and there may have been some relation between his version and Mary Sidney's version. But again, I think that there is that distinction that has to be made between the closet dramas and the public theater plays.
So the one thing that I think is really important to point out, and that you definitely illustrate through your book, is the circles that these people were traveling in. And I
Yes.
use the word traveling as a metaphor, obviously, but the interrelationships that occurred between many of these characters that we're talking about, many of them were relatives by marriage to some other member of the family. Many of them were cousins by marriage or cousins in some other way. There's a lot of incestuous aspect here, and I don't mean that in the salacious way. I mean that just in the fact that everybody was pretty much related to everybody in some way or another within these elite circles. Thus, a lot of the sharing of writings, of poetry, of, as you call them, closet plays, a lot of the sharing of sonnets and works that weren't meant to be seen by anyone except for those within the circle. And it was almost
Absolutely.
like this sort of secret game that they played. It was almost like having a chess society where they all tried to outdo each other and master each other's moves or take each other's work and change it, perfect it. You talked about the Spanish tragedy. It went through so many different revisions, and almost everybody touched it at some point, including Johnson. Oh, I'm going to add a scene here, or I'm going to change this moment between these two characters, was going on all the time.
Right.
And we see that more and more now as we do deeper dives into these works. And we come to the conclusion that it was this giant collaboration going on through this literary society, as it were, the literati of the day, I would say.
Right.
And you illustrate that very well in your book, especially with, like I mentioned before, this sort of first person narrative that we have of Sackville telling his version of events and his story and about his relationship with these characters. Are the other books written that same style?
Yes.
So
yes, they're all the Thomas Watson one is written from Watson's from his point of view and his experiences, and it focuses mostly on his youth, young adulthood, his experiences overseas and the continent, how he developed as a writer, and how he gained recognition while on the continent, and primarily in Italy. Spent a lot of time in Italy, but also in France as well. And definitely, when he came back to England, he was already, a regarded writer as a young man. And in the early '80s, how it's really people don't know about Thomas Watson now, but he was a really big literary figure in the 1580s, and he has a great case, just like Sackville does. Thomas Watson has a great case. He has the same basically reason for using the Shakespeare name as the Christopher Marlowe theory, is that he basically faked his death. Now, Christopher Marlowe died 2 weeks before the Shakespeare name was used in print for Venus and Adonis. Watson died the year before in late 1592. So in terms of the similarities too, between Watson's work and the Shakespeare canon is very similar, so much so that in the mid 1590s, Shakespeare was considered to be Watson's heir. He was basically, his successor. He was so similar in style and substance. And if you read Watson's poetry, his sonnets, Hecatompathia, a century of love, passionate century of love, which is an excellent sonnet cycle. Is it as good as Shakespeare's sonnets? No, it's not, but it's very good. It's excellent, and you can definitely see the relationship between the two, and also other works that Watson wrote. But I've always been intrigued by the idea that the name Shakespeare was used because the person was pretending to be dead. And so I've always thought it was a very convincing thing that the Christopher Marlowe theory had for it. But yes, in terms of to answer your question, yes, it was very much, I did a lot of research. There's an excellent book about Thomas Watson called Renaissance Man by Ian Johnson. And it's an excellent book. It's really the only one written that in depth about Thomas Watson. But I got a lot of my research about information about Watson from that book. The John Ford book is also heavily, there's a lot of the relationship between John Ford who was a much later playwright, and Francis Bacon. And Francis Bacon plays an important role in that theory, that point of view. It's that Francis Bacon's older brother, Anthony Bacon, was actually the author of the original poetry, Venus and Adonis, and The Rape of Lucrece, and the early sonnets. And that the plays were actually just purely collaborations, but then were all revised by Ford later in the 1600s, 1610s, and 1620s, and was basically hired by Francis Bacon to do so. And then Emiliani has her story and her involvement, and she spent in that story. She spends most of her life pretending to be a man, and so in order to operate in the ways to get things done, she had to pretend to be a man. So she has her relationships with various different people, her relationships to her two husbands, who are quite important, and to others. So it all these relationships are extremely important. We have to understand that these times were very social times. People were constantly interacting with each other and also mentioning each other in their work. And I think the most difficult thing for the Stratfordians to really combat and to reply to is this complete lack of evidence that Shakespeare was in that scene. There's no evidence that he was involved in the literary scene whatsoever. There's like people who should be knowing him, who should know of his existence and should be speaking of him, don't do it. He's a complete ghost from the literary scene during those times. The further you look, you just see like these people they all knew each other. They all wrote about each other. They all borrowed from each other. They all collaborated. A lot of them collaborated together. So it to have this most important, literary figure at the time just be completely absent from any of those communications or references or anything else social is just very bizarre. And there's just no way to really explain it other than that this person was a mask. It was a front.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And so one of the things I want to ask you about, though, is so you in these 4 books, and obviously I've only read this first one, that you touch upon different people, sometimes the same people in a different book. So you have sort of, for a lack of a better analogy, this Marvel universe that you've created here out of history that you didn't create. History created this Marvel universe of characters, right? These literati who cross each other's paths. Do you have crossovers in the book? So like there's a Thomas Watson chapter in this first book. So then does Thomas Watson's book have a Sackville chapter, and do those stories interblend? Do they intermix? Sort of like in the comic book world, you have, Spider-Man and Wolverine end up teaming up together, but then over in the X-Men comics, it's talked about that Spider-Man and Wolverine ended up working together. You know what I mean? That type of a thing?
Right. Yeah, no, definitely. They're basically I would say to think of them as 4 separate universes that are very similar to each other. So they're like the multiverse, right? So going back to the Marvel reference, like the idea of the multiverse is that you have the same people, but experiencing situations differently because the situations is a different universe. So in the Watson novel, for example, Sackville is a very important character. He's like he's not that heavily involved in the writing of the plays and the poetry, but he's like a mentor to Watson. So Watson, he enters the court scene, and there's of course all these factions at court. Queen Elizabeth's court was filled with factions, and so Sackville was fascinating by him. Whether or not he wrote the canon or not, he was a very interesting person, and he was a very independent person. So he operated kind of like on his own terms. And so because he was that way in the Watson novel, he becomes like this coach almost to Watson to basically show him how to survive at court, to be very careful of whether it be, Oxford's faction or Leicester's faction. Leicester, of course, being, the most, I guess you could say, prominent faction, and with the most members to it, like Edward Dyer was part of it. But also to Thomas North's brother was highly involved in the Leicester faction, Leicester circle. And so in that case, you have Sackville, and he becomes like this mentor to Watson in the Watson novel. Emilie Lanier, she's in the Sackville novel. Of course, she comes in later and is like the lover to both initially Thomas Middleton, and then she falls. Well, John Webster meets her and falls head over heels and in love with Emilie Lanier, and she ends up being with him. So there's like a three-way romance between Middleton and Webster are friends, which is true. So, and there's dedications from them both to each other's works. So it's very clear that the two were friends. And so I put in this story that Lanier, who was at the same time as them, and Lanier is a fascinating person. Again, another person that even if she didn't write the Shakespeare canon, she's very much worth looking into. The one book of poetry that she published in 1611, which happens to be the same year that the King James Bible was published in, she actually argues that women are superior to men in this work of fiction, and that the fall of mankind in the Garden of Eden is more, the blame should be put on Adam more than on Eve. And she literally argues this in her poem, and it's really beautifully written, really great. And this again, 1611 is when she published this book. She never was able to publish anything else before or after. She had a lot of difficulties. She lived a long life, though. She lived until the 1630s or 40s, 1640s, I believe. And she tried to start a school, which then failed shortly after. So she was able to publish that book, but it was not, it was not something where she was able to continue as a poet. She really tried hard to win patronage. And again, patronage was very important in those days. I'm sure for your listeners now, they know this, that in those days that the authors were very desperate to win the protection and the support of a patron. So a wealthy earl, for example, or someone else of the nobility, aristocracy, that could support and protect them. And oftentimes these authors had to change. Like Ben Jonson had many patrons throughout his career. And, so Emilie Lanier was trying to pursue that. And in her dedication to that book of poetry, she dedicated to like various different, all these different women that were very powerful, including the Queen herself. So Queen Anna, King James' wife, and just a number of different powerful women she dedicated that book of poetry to. But she wasn't able to secure a patronage. So she struggled in obscurity, But by the fact that she was able to publish that, I find just absolutely amazing.
Well, it had to be because of the dedication to all those powerful women. It had to be one of them or more of them helped that happen in this mostly man's world that she was living in, especially now that James was king.
Yes.
And they probably saw it as, okay, she did that. Good for you. That little pet project is over. Now go back to being a woman and doing womanly things that you're supposed to be doing. It's extremely patriarchal. I think you nailed it on the
head. I think that I absolutely agree with you. I think that's what happened.
Ha ha, that was funny. Good for you. Now go back to knitting or whatever, right?
Right. Yeah. It was fascinating times. Absolutely. So many, and then speaking of women and men, there was like this battle of the sexes that happened after that publication of that book. It didn't happen directly after, but there was a number of publications by women in the late 1610s. I believe it started in 1615 up until like 1620-ish. And if you remember in the novel, I explore that. So in the later chapter of the novel, the Thomas Middleton chapter, there's this battle of the sexes scenes going on. And there was an author, I'm forgetting his name. He was like this male chauvinist pig author who hated women, and he became this well-known, notorious, champion of men and so forth. And it was this back and forth between these female writers and these male writers. There's a scene in the novel with that guy, and there's a whole setup where basically Francis Bacon has been forced to set up this humiliation of Emiliane in front of everyone at Francis Bacon's party. And Francis Bacon, again, like he's another character that you'll see pop up in every single of the 4 novels. So Francis Bacon is a consistent character in all 4 novels, and he plays an especially important role in the John Ford novel. But he's also important in the Watson novel too. So Watson meets him in France when Bacon is a young man, and he goes there to Paris as a young man as part of this entourage with forgetting the guy's name, but he goes there, and that's where Watson and Francis Bacon meet. So there's all these characters that are all entwined together. There's French characters. There's the French philosopher Montaigne, who in the Sackville novel is like a very dear friend to Sackville throughout their life, and they influence each other. I feel very strongly that whoever wrote the Shakespeare plays and poetry was heavily influenced by Montaigne's essays and by Montaigne's philosophy. Basically, it's a philosophy of doubt, of uncertainty, of not knowing, but also a very deep humanity, too. There's a really deep, deep humanity and very strong sense of humor, a very earthy kind of way of living life. Montaigne's essays, I absolutely love them. They're fantastic, and you can just pick at any point, just pick any one of those chapters and just read a little bit, and you'll get something out of it. You don't have to read the whole thing; it's massive, but you just pick out little bits and pieces, and it's great. So in Montaigne is a big influence. His friend Etienne de Boissy is another important character in the Sackville novel. He is a figure who is kind of like this adopted brother to Sackville, and is another important character as well. Boissy is another fascinating person.
Yes, and as I was reading the book, I found myself on occasion, like oftentimes I'd be reading, and I would just pull out my phone and do a quick Google search of some of the characters, including him, to just see what the historical context was, and to see how much of that true history you included into the book. And I think the best historical fiction does that. I always use the analogy of my wife and I watching the TV series Vikings and finding ourselves doing the same thing, researching on our phones in the middle of an episode and going, wait a minute, did that really happen? And wait a minute, who was that character again? And then finding how much real truth there was in the screenwriting. And I think that makes it more fun, makes it more intriguing to the reader or to the viewer when you suddenly find yourself wanting to learn more about the real history. And that's why I think that type of historical fiction is the road we need to dismiss once and for all this Stratford mythology.
Yes, absolutely. I'm really 100% with you on that. Whenever I read a book or I watch a film or I watch a TV series that is historical fiction, and I'm watching it, I'm like, there's these real historical people popping up, and I'm wondering, I wonder if did this actually happen? Like, or how much of this did actually happen? And I'll go and I'll take a look too, and I'll look and see, and I'm like, oh yeah, that actually did. And like the moment when I can confirm when the author or filmmakers or screenwriters took the time to research something and add a little detail about these historical people that is real, and it's like, oh, that was really cool, and it makes me even more interested in the story, and also wants me to, encourages me to go back in time too. And so, for example, I'll just throw in one more and one last reference was that I listened to your interview of the gentleman who believed that the true author was King James, and there was mention at the beginning that his tutor as a little kid was this guy named George Buchanan.
Mm-hmm.
George Buchanan was a great figure. And certainly in the story of James's life, he was known primarily as being a child abuser and beat King James really bad, and James hated him for that. But prior to that, he was this whole part of this humanist movement of the early 1500s to the mid 1500s. He died in 1582. But another figure that George Buchanan was the teacher of Montaigne and Boissy. So here he was, this guy from Scotland. He actually went to France and taught at the school that Boissy and Montaigne were students at. So they had Buchanan as their teacher, and so he was an influence. Boissy, his one book that he wrote, the Discourse on Voluntary Servitude, which is almost like this anarchist or libertarian pamphlet, really great work on basically how people are subject themselves to the dominance of those in power, whether it be king or somebody else.
It's basically a condemnation of the people that they bring tyranny upon themselves by succumbing to it, right? Is basically what Boissy was. That's his premise, is we all deserve the tyranny we get, type of a thing.
Yes, that's it in a nutshell, basically. Yeah, and it's really well written. It's excellent, but that's basically it. But what's interesting to know about Buchanan was that he was very much he believed that if a king or a queen or any ruler became a tyrant, that it was the people's right to overthrow that king. So he was very much, Buchanan was very much like and he wrote about other things as well, but in his limited way, he was like a pro-democracy individual, and you could see was definitely an influence on both Boissy and Montaigne.
Wasn't Latin like the reason they bring him to France, right, is because he's so well known for his teaching of Latin. And I remember King James was like considered one of the best Latin speakers in all of Europe, and considered Latin to be his native language, not Scottish.
Yeah. People have to know that the power of the Latin language was so dominant in intellectual culture in those days. Montaigne, his father, had a very specific education for him, that he was only going to be taught to speak in Latin as a child. And he was removed from the family and lived elsewhere. And he had to be he was speaking only in Latin. Thomas Watson wrote primarily in Latin. He wrote some works in English, but he felt in the 1580s that Latin was the language that would be remembered. That was the language that was used. English was not highly regarded in those days. So
there are accounts of James criticizing others for their pronunciation of Latin. Like he would correct people at court. No, that's not. You're not saying it right. You need to say it like this. That was King James. So that's a very interesting premise to then connect. If Buchanan is this, basically Latin professor, then it would make sense that he is sort of a true Republican, small r, not in the context of modern republicanism, but a true Republican, which would mean that he, of course, would have this feeling that it was the duty of Brutus and the conspirators to rise up against Julius Caesar, for instance.
Right.
That it was the duty of Octavius to put Mark Antony down, because Mark Antony basically, threw aside his Roman citizenry, right, and became this, almost foreign ruler in a sense, right? So that makes total sense then that Boissy, who's being taught by Buchanan, and the same with when you look at some of the writings of Montaigne, like that, it sort of bled into them, didn't it? This idea that tyranny is wrong and that authoritarianism is wrong in a world where that was dangerous, very dangerous thinking.
Yes, and absolutely, and that's why I show also too. It's Buchanan was a playwright, so he wrote plays, and in Latin, of course, it was in Latin, these humanist plays, but he wrote these plays, and that was another reason why I wanted to include him in the story, was that I also felt that he was an influence on Sackville, and so again, Sackville was the same generation as Montaigne and Boissy. So they were of the same generation, and of course, Sackville, when he was in England and he was studying law, he was in Inns of Court, the Inns of Court were just filled with a lot of intellectual stimulation. It wasn't just only a place where people would go to learn to become barristers, become lawyers. It was also a place where, these guys were writing plays, they were writing poetry, they were discussing, they had a lot of discussions, there was a lot of, presentations, and that was a big thing, a lot came out of those Inns of Court. And there's a reason that whoever was the true author of the plays and poetry of Shakespeare, there's an enormous amount of references to the legal world. It's a very important aspect that has to be considered, is that this person or these people really knew like the legal system. So much so that they could just use the legal terms as, it just come to them because they're just so much a part of their life and their thinking, that they were, their mind operated in the legal world.
Another entirely different language involved there too, which was known as law French. And
yes,
and if you weren't a member of the Inns of Court, you didn't speak law French. You couldn't read law French. You had to learn that through going to law school at that time.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that was definitely, I believe in Hamlet, there's some references to that. And that's, there's also one of the things that Sabrina Feldman, I really got to mention Sabrina Feldman, by the way. So Sabrina Feldman is the person who is the main champion for Thomas Sackville, and wrote some great books. She wrote two prominent books, one about the apocryphal Shakespeare plays, which is a really great argument that Shakespeare was actually a writer, but just a really horrible one. And then the other one was that Sackville was the true author. The Thomas Sackville and the Shakespeare glass slipper is the one. And she makes a really great case for Thomas Sackville. And one of many, 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 many things that she discusses is that there was, going back to the legal system, that there was this case in 1562, I believe, where this Hales versus Petit, I think it was called.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like this very specific reference to this case. And it's in a scene, I think, between the grave diggers.
Right.
And they're talking about Ophelia because, her being a suicide, will she, and so then there's this argument about whether someone actually took their own life or the water took their life or something.
Right. That was Hales. It was Hales' widow was arguing that she should still be able to inherit her husband's holdings. But the law said because he committed suicide that all of his holdings were forfeit to the crown, I think, and then the crown gave it to Pettit. But yeah, that is very much a very specific court case that these two gravediggers are arguing over in the middle of Hamlet, and very much one of the arguments that says, okay, whoever wrote Hamlet definitely was a lawyer and definitely understood that case and there's a lot in Hamlet that is about possession, ownership, birthright, and inheritance. There's a ton of that in Hamlet.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. And one wonders, whoever wrote it was like, why was that? And I know for the Oxfordian theory, there's some really good cases and arguments to be made that it was Oxford who wrote that play because of his own personal experiences of ownership and loss of ownership, and things being taken away when he was young because he was a ward and so forth. And definitely, it's just he's one of many people that are worth looking into as possible, not only as possible candidates, but just as historical figures.
Well, and I have to tell you, because of your book, I have now since reached out to Sabrina Feldman to invite her to be a guest on the program. I haven't heard back from her, but I hope that she will consider coming on because I'd love to discuss her books for the listeners, because as all our listeners know, I'm an Oxfordian. I believe Oxford, if he wasn't the only writer, he was the principal writer, or at least the editor-in-chief. I'm leaning more towards that theory, that he was the editor-in-chief of this brand that was created called William Shakespeare.
Mm-hmm.
I believe he invented it, but then he brought in under his fold other writers to help him continue the work and flesh out certain plays and certain messages that he was trying to send to various places at various times. I'm leaning more and more towards the idea that Francis Bacon was involved in some way. And that leads me to another aspect of your book, because I believe, and we talked about the Inns of Court, and the Inns of Court were not only these very exclusive societies, either you were a member of the inns or you weren't, and there were rivalries between certain inns like Middle Temple and Inner Temple and Gray's Inn and Lincoln's. But if you were an innsman, you were an innsman, regardless of which one you were in.
Mm-hmm.
Almost like fraternities, right?
Mm-hmm.
But also, I believe that those are some of the places where secret societies were, I don't want to say invented because I think they predate the Inns of Court, but I would say were fostered the way that these literati societies and circles were fostered by the Inns of Court. And we'd be foolish to think that secret societies don't exist when we have so much evidence of the fact that they do, whether that be something as simple as the Masonic Temple and the Masons, or whether that be in a more modern context, the Skull and Bones Society, which I believe is connected to Harvard Law, ironically, right? So there's one that we know for a fact. We know for a fact that that secret society exists, and it's connected to a very prominent law school. So here we have modern context of truth and proof of these. And you touch on that a lot in this book. I don't know about the other books, but and what you call it, and spoiler alert, you call it the futurum. Where does that come from? That word, that name, why that word, that name? Is there some historical research you found that connects to that? Did you choose that name to sort of shield what it might have been? Like it might have been the Rosicrucians. Tell me more about the origins of that.
Yeah, well, it's definitely a fictional creation of mine. I like the way it also, for two things, it looks and sounds great. So for me as a writer, that's very important. For something to look good in print, to sound good, and so it is, of course. So it's Latin for the future. So the Futurum was a male secret society that I created, and that there was a female version as well called R. Arcadia, which in the novel you'll see that Mary Sidney Herbert, when of course she became Herbert later on, and Amelia Lanier are part of, and other women are a part of it. And so certainly these are both secret societies that were modeled on real ones. I did not come across any evidence that a group called the Futurum existed or R. Arcadia existed. It was something that I just completely created. But you're right, though. There's no doubt about it that secret societies existed. I was recently in Scotland and had a wonderful time. And so there's the very first Freemason Lodge is in Edinburgh, and that's Lodge number 1. And I went there and visited. Very nice, very beautiful. I'm not a member of the Freemasons, so I couldn't go inside. So I did take pictures of the outside. And so that was in 1599. So they have the first, we know for concrete evidence, and they accept it, the Freemasons themselves. It's historically known, it's publicly known that in 1599 was the first recorded meeting of Freemasons in Edinburgh in Scotland. Now, one of the things you'll find interesting in reading Sabrina Feldman's book is that she came across evidence that Thomas Sackville was a member of the Freemasons, and at a very young age, based not like super young, but kind of young, in the 1560s, was already a master. He was already one of the heads of Freemasonry in the 1560s. So one of the things why I introduced these secret societies is that I have been interested in them for quite a while. And one realizes that a lot of history was molded by secret societies. And I think it's important to know that the reasons for the origins of secret societies is that a lot of the ideas that the people believed in would be, if they were to publicly declare them or to share them or write about them, would cause them to get killed. Right. So we have to understand the times that the church was in power, and their orthodoxy was the way. So when we think about fascism, right? So fascism definitely existed in those days. It was a religious state, a totalitarian religious state. And so if you were in any way of a free thinker, of an intellectual, of a creative person who may have some interest in the occult, or maybe are an atheist or agnostic, you certainly couldn't publicly, let everyone know that you were. So a lot of the existence of secret societies were to protect the individuals that were members of these secret societies. And so the thing about the Shakespeare canon that it has to be considered is how could whoever wrote them, how could this person get away with it? We're looking at times where Thomas Nash, who was a brilliant writer, who I didn't really give him enough credit in any of the novels, but I definitely think he had a hand in the Shakespeare canon, especially the 1590s. Brilliant writer. And so he was punished severely a number of times. And he was just one of many people. Ben Jonson was imprisoned. Thomas Kidd was in prison and tortured. Marlowe, I think, was probably tortured and killed. A lot of other people were imprisoned. This guy named Stubbs wrote this thing about arguing that the Queen of England should marry an Englishman, not a Frenchman, and so then she had his hand cut off, and basically joked that, hey, now your namesake actually lives up to yourself by having a stub of a hand. And so you have these times where if you did or said anything wrong, you get punished for it. And to have like the Venus and Adonis, which could be seen as a satire in Queen Elizabeth herself for lusting after young men, which she was known for. And then also the following year, the rape of Lucrece, which almost argues against monarchy, because it tells the story of how the Roman Republic was formed because of this rape of this poor Lucrece by Tarquin. And then later in the 1590s, and this again, 1590s were a very tense period because Queen Elizabeth was aging. She could die at any moment. She didn't have an heir. And so it was very tense. It's like, who would become king or queen of England after she died? And so one thing you could never talk about was the secession. Like you could not talk about it. And there was this one play which she would certainly, or this one historical person she would not want written about or performed about was Richard II, because he abdicated his crown to Henry IV, Henry Bolingbroke. And we know that Richard II was written and circulated privately in the late 1590s. And then, of course, it was used by the Earl of Essex in his uprising in 1600. He performed Richard II. And this whole time, Shakespeare never gets punished. There's never any mention. There's no questioning of him, of like, why did you do this? Why were you involved? Why did you write it or rewrite this play? What were you in? Nothing at all. There's no mention of Shakespeare at all. And so it's just very mind-boggling that Stratfordians, it can't really explain why Shakespeare continued to elude consequences. Why did he, what was it? Why, and so my feeling is that whoever was the true author, either they themselves were enormously powerful, and we can look at Sackville, and we can certainly look at that. Certainly by the 1590s, he was enormously powerful. His positions at court, he had gained a stature very, very high. And, he's certainly someone who maybe even behind the scenes had even more power. We don't know, but we certainly know
his father had a tremendous amount of power and helped build that empire for him, right? I mean, that's historically accurate.
Well, yeah. Well, I mean, we do know for certain. You're talking about people being related to each other. For one thing, we know Thomas Sackville was the cousin of Queen Elizabeth. They were cousins, so there's that relationship.
Through her mother, but through Anne Boleyn, right?
I believe so. Yeah. That was, and so they were related in that way. Or and if it wasn't, so for example, if it was somebody else like Thomas Watson or John Ford or Milianier, they had the protection of powerful people. So the reason why I introduced this secret societies and how they operate was that I really, whoever, somebody decided that the Shakespeare canon was going to be, preserved in 1623, and that there was this enormous body of work, 36 plays, more likely 40 plays, 2 narrative poems, 154 sonnets.
Yes.
And so there's this big body of work that is out there, and why was the author protected, or authors protected? What was the reason for it? And so my argument is that it was part of something where there was an intention to create something, and it even included Don Quixote, but that's a whole other story. But
see, I would argue that all of that and those aspects surrounding these theories is far more plausible and far more believable than some country bumpkin from Stratford just invented it all straight out of his imagination and was this super genius, Wile E. Coyote, supra genius character. And not to belabor my Marvel Universe analogy, but you've got this entire universe of all these characters, these literati, these nobles, these elites of the Elizabethan court, later the Jacobean court. And they're all related to each other by marriage and by cousins and connected, and the power structure is all there. And suddenly you insert this DC character, William Shakespeare of Stratford, into the middle of this Marvel universe, and it stands out like a sore thumb. It's like if you drop Superman into the X-Men, you'd be going, wait a minute, something doesn't belong here. And the Stratfordians would have us believe that their man is some sort of a Superman who was just imbued with these magnificent powers from another planet, and no one else could touch him.
Right.
And it makes it's literally cartoonish.
It doesn't make any sense. And to be honest, there have been many times where I'm like, I really want to believe it was Shakespeare. I really, really want to just make it, final, complete. Yeah, it was him. And so I just dug. And it's just like, okay, there's got to be something. And I think that they really think, so many things that are against Shakespeare's case. But the thing that I think people have to know is that, it's not. So Shakespeare, he came from wealth. I think the key distinction is that he came from like country money, and he came from business money and property money and business dealings. So he had money, but what's really lacking from Shakespeare's story, and you'll get this from his biographers, right? All his biographers will admit this to you, is that there's no evidence of an education. There's no evidence that he, it doesn't mean like he didn't even have to go to university. Like it doesn't like he had to go to Cambridge or Oxford, but he needed to, we need to have some evidence that the guy was educated. And so, for example, we have Ben Jonson, who didn't go to university, but he went to Westminster, which was a fantastic school, and he was exposed to enormous amount of education as a young child. We also have Thomas Kidd, who didn't go to university, but again, like Ben Jonson, he went to the Merchant Taylors' School, which is another London school that was available to the lower middle classes, and he received education. And then you'd have some examples of some kind of like creative life, which we get from people like Thomas Kidd, or Richard Barnfield, or name any other person from that time that is not been researched anywhere close to as much as Shakespeare. And you'll find something interesting. You'll find some kind of letter or dedication or historical note or something, and you'll be, oh, okay, yeah, this person was an artist. This person was a creative person. They had a creative life, and that just is completely absent. Education and the writer's life is just completely absent from any documentation from the man from Stratford.
Yeah, it's obviously. So back to your book, a couple questions I wanted to ask you about. One is your style of writing. When it comes to dialogue, you don't use quotation marks. You use dashes or hyphens, almost script-like. Is that on purpose? Was that to save typing? Was that to reduce characters? Like what is with that choice? It doesn't impede the reading of the book, nor does it cause too much confusion. Sometimes there was a couple of times I'm like, wait a minute, who's speaking here? But for the most part, it doesn't impede. enjoyment of the book, but it's definitely a clear choice, and I'm just curious about that choice.
Sure. So I'll just admit, so I have been just as long as I've been a fan of Shakespeare, I've been an enormous fan of James Joyce. And so it was a choice that Joyce used early on in his fiction, was not to use quotation marks. And so the idea behind the not using quotation marks is like a rebellion against being a quotation mark, if that makes sense. So the idea is that there is as a writer, there is the pursuit of originality, right? Every writer wants to be original. Everybody wants to be new and fresh, or do something different, interesting, or stand out. And in whatever way, maybe even in a very conventional way. But the idea behind it is to open up. So it's a way of opening up language and the spoken word. I agree with Joyce. I feel like that the quotation marks are like prison bars. They're prison bars to the language, to the words that are being spoken. And I far prefer to just see the words, the dialogue spoken without those prison bars behind them on either side, so that you're looking at it. And it's a choice of mine that I refuse to use quotation marks. I try, whenever, what I do is I give little hints early on to the reader that you're about to read something that's unusual. So I'll start off with like the chapter. If you notice with the chapters, the page numbers are completely wrong.
It's the next question I was going to ask you: is the table of contents? Is there a code in there? Is there something I should be seeing here? Are you making fun of the first folio and the fact that the page numbers and the table of contents are incorrect in the first folio?
Yeah. No, that you'll find that style of table of contents in all my fiction. So I like to do it that way, where you start at 99, then 88, then 77, then 66, and so it's more than anything. It's just a surrealist play with language, and it's also another way for me to clue the reader that, okay, wait, this is unusual, so you should expect the unusual when it comes to language when you're about to read this story. And then as you read the story, and you'll find that there's these passages that are like, wait, is this the story? Or wait, was this like some kind of poetry? Or what the hell is going on here?
I have to admit to you, I haven't read any James Joyce for 40 years. I think my high school freshman AP English teacher made us read Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, I think is about the only thing. And like I said, that's, I'm getting up there. That's about 40 years ago. So I would have never made the James Joyce connection because it wasn't anywhere fresh in my mind.
Sure. Yeah. And and also too, like, people don't have to, as a reader, they don't have to know about James Joyce. They don't have to know about surrealist authors, or like another author that other ones are like Mallarmé is another French poet that I liked, and Rimbaud and Lautréamont. Like, person doesn't have to. I mentioned their names in terms of like the dedication. I mentioned these authors' names, and so I dedicate it to them. But a person doesn't have to know about them. These are things that I put into the story. It's a decision that I made a long time ago, about 15 years ago, that I wanted to explore narrative in unconventional ways, because I felt, I was writing narratives in realistic prose for a long time, short stories and novels. And while I love realistic prose, I love naturalism very much so, I felt that there was something missing from it. And so I wanted to disrupt the language, the narrative, disrupt it in various different ways, to kind of place the reader in a different terrain. So put them in a different environment as a reader, in terms of how you're approaching the story and these characters and the themes, so that it opens up passageways of their mind, of their consciousness, into reality. So you're enjoying the story, but also it's like through that disruption, it places you in an unusual, uncomfortable place. But when you're in that place, though, you're going to see some really deep truths. And that's what I really, what I'm going for when I'm aiming for when I do this that kind of writing.
And I would argue that the book is definitely non-linear in many ways, but I don't know that and for those people who are like, oh no, not stream of consciousness, that's difficult. I don't see it as really like a stream of consciousness novel. However, it is a first person narrative. It is the voice of Sackville. And again, it's non-linear. It can bounce around from time to time because it's about his experiences and relationships with different people at different times in his life. But I wouldn't call it a stream of consciousness novel. So listeners, don't be turned off by that idea of James Joyce or Virginia Woolf, for instance.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, it has a story in it, very much so. It's the intent. While it's maybe there's unconventional stuff, it's definitely meant to be like a page turner as well.
And tell me about the poetry in between certain scenes, I'll call them, because sometimes the poetry appears within the chapter. Sometimes it appears at the beginning of the chapter, at the end of the chapter. And is it meant to be poetry? I read it as poetry, but maybe it's not meant to be poetry. But there's very interesting paragraphs that show up that are very stream of consciousness. In fact, I would say, tell me a little bit about that. Is that you inserting your poetry, your work, your thoughts into the novel as sort of a collection inside of a book? Explain some of that to me if you could.
Sure. So it's again that it's part of that kind of like that literary experiential adventure of going to a different place while you're in the midst of the story, right? So there's this definite intent by me to engage the reader in reading the story and finding out what's going to happen next. Who are these people? What's going to happen to Sackville? What's going to happen to so and so? And get involved in the relationships. But these poetic interruptions, right? You can find them either again like in the middle of a chapter, at the beginning of a chapter, at the end of the chapter. They'll use language from the different poets that are described in the story. So you'll find language that was used by Watson in his poetry, Robert Greene in his prose books. So there's language used almost like in a cut-up fashion that,
Yeah.
So like Burroughs and Geisen, they created this thing called the cut-up. And so the cut-up is you take phrases from different places and put them together, or you can do it with imagery too. You cut up words and images and place them however you want. And so I was doing that a little bit in the sense of taking language from the times, from these authors, creating my own language, but also too inserting things that I will hear. So if I'm writing, in the moment, if I'm writing at a cafe here in Los Angeles somewhere, and I'm overhearing a conversation by a couple or people or a family, and I'll insert the words that I'm actually hearing from those people into those poetic passages. Or if I'm listening to music, if I'm at home and I'll listen to music, I'll actually insert lines of dialogue or lines of from the song, from the lyrics that I'm hearing, modern lyrics. And so people read and are like, wait a second, that sounds like some song I know. So it's all put together in this way. And again, it's this relationship between time and space. So we're reading a historical novel. We're engaged in that period of history. We're there, and certainly while I was writing it, I felt I was there, which I loved. And it made me not want to stop writing the books. I love just the whole experience of writing these stories so much because I love that period so much. But then it's also engaging in terms of, well, we're also not only there, but we're here and now. We're in the here and now of modern times of the 2020s. And so there's that way where I feel that poetry can place us in these different dimensions of time and space, whether it be from music that we're listening to or people's conversation that we're hearing in the here and now, or to the back to the historical period and reading poems by the authors at that time.
Well, we're definitely fans of the cut up here at Don't Quill the Messenger. If you look at our logo and the way that the letters are pieced together like a ransom note, as designed by producer Jake many years ago now. But that's been our logo from day one. And we understand the cut up and it works
very
for us.
cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Derek, it's been a fascinating time to share with you about this book. I didn't know that there are 3 others, so now I have to go searching. But before I let you go, I want to share with the listeners how they can go about finding this book and the others. This one is Anonymous Agnostic Antichrists. And before we get into how to find it and where to find you and all of that, I do want to talk about the title real quick. I found myself unwilling to take the book with me on trips or places where I would be reading it and people would see the cover and think that I was some kind of a weirdo.
Yeah.
Because of the title. But it's important to note that it truly does describe these characters, doesn't it? That, first of all, the anonymity of the writing, the idea that they are agnostic in their philosophies and their approach and their humanism. And you do a great job in the book of pointing out the difference between those characters who are completely ruled by the religion of the time and the orthodoxy of the time, and how they look at someone like Sackville and whoever the writers of Shakespeare were or are as sort of giving into the sin of pride, elevating man to the level of a god, and thus the Antichrist aspect of it, right? The non-believer of Christ is an Antichrist. The Antichrist is not necessarily the devil or Satan. An Antichrist can be anyone who disavows Christ, and even to the extent that these men in this book have these questions about the future, the futurum of the universe, as it were. And so it's a perfectly apt title. But yeah, it can get you some interesting looks if you're carrying it around.
Yeah, thank you for that description. That was just fantastic description of the title and the reason for it. Absolutely, and it certainly is the case. I think that it's really important to know that people like Montaigne, the authors of the Shakespeare canon, made a very clear decision that human beings were worth exploring. So that in and of itself is very radical. It may not seem that radical today because we're all obsessed with ourselves. But but in those days, the idea that human beings were important enough to explore and to investigate and to cherish and to even, to celebrate, and to say that we are amazing. We're amazing, creatures. And to ask these questions was very radical. And so in that self, they were very much Antichrist in that sense. And I feel that I wondered if I should use that title when I first was writing the book, but I felt like it was just the right thing, and of course, alliteration in those days was highly used, so I felt like it was appropriate, the use of alliteration, and that cover image too is a very mysterious and fascinating painting, work of cartography. So it's a map, fool's cap map of the world. It's on the cover. And it was created sometime it would probably no later than 1590. We don't know who the artist is, so it's anonymous. But it's really worth, if one is interested, there's a bunch of things written on that map that are very mysterious. Mm-hmm. And you can actually find out, it's all Latin, and you can go and find the translations of what all those phrases are on that map and on that work of art. But it's very fascinating.
It is indeed. And, the entire time I'm reading the book and I'm thinking about these concepts, the anonymous agnostic antichrists, and all I could hear in my head was Hamlet speaking. What a piece of work is a man, right? How noble in reason, how infinite in faculty. What else does he say? How like an angel in apprehension. Right.
Like a god.
And he even says, how like a god. And that's the concept, isn't it? Like, Hamlet technically is one of these men, isn't he?
Yes, absolutely. 100%. I love that you brought Hamlet up because that play, wow. I mean, just besides it's just majesty as a work of art. it's a great work of philosophy.
We just finished a production of it, so it's very fresh in my mind right now. So
nice.
I can't say that Hamlet's running around in my brain all the time, but for the last 10 weeks, it's been running around in my brain because we just finished a production of it. So,
it's unending, and it totally deserves all the praise and all the adulation it's received these centuries. It is just a remarkable work of art and philosophy too. I really feel that there was deep intentions behind the creation of it.
And yet, what is this quintessence of dust?
Right.
Man delights not me.
Right. Just
Derek,
ongoing question.
Thank you again. Folks, it is Anonymous Agnostic Antichrists, Derek Hunter, Derek, and Hunter, just like it sounds and just like it's spelled.
Yes. If people look for me online, by the way, so if you go on Amazon, there's 3 of us. So there's 3 Derek Hunters. There's me. If you'll find if you type in my name, Anonymous Agnostic Antichrist, of course, the book will show up. But there's 2 others. There's a comic book artist who does comic books. And there's another guy who is a podcast host who is on the right wing of the spectrum. He wrote a book called Outrage Inc. That is not me. That's a different Derek Hunter. So there will be 3 different Derek Hunters you might see pop up if you type in Derek Hunter. But if you type in Anonymous Agnostic Antichrist, that will pop up. And also, too, it'll be interesting if you Google Derek Hunter and Shakespeare, I'll pop up. So I'm definitely the Derek Hunter that is most associated with Shakespeare.
That's great.
So you can just do that.
That's perfect. That makes it very easy, doesn't it?
Yep.
Well, again, thank you so much, Derek. It's been a wonderful conversation. I enjoyed the book. I'm going to now have to look for the others. How do I find the others? Just by doing the same thing? Look for you the same way?
Yes, you can do that. I'm on Amazon. I also have a website called love-chaos.com. So again, it's love, LOVE-chaos, CHAOS.com. All of my works are on there. I have 20 books. I'm currently in the middle of another project, writing short stories about the tarot. So each tarot card has a short story. And so I'm in the middle of that. I'm working with an artist from Belgium who's doing brilliant work on the covers. And so that's the current project I'm in.
Oh, that would be fascinating. I would be very interested in that.
Oh, sure. Yeah. And it's great that they're short stories. So, they're easy to read, quick and easy to read. But yeah, definitely Anonymous Agnostic Antichrist books. They're all in there. So, on the website, also on Amazon, they're all available. People have been reading them and loving them and so forth. And so they're definitely, it's out there in the public. And, I really just am so grateful to be on here with you. This was a really great conversation. It was really interesting. I could talk forever about this with you, but we are, of course, limited with time. But yeah, really great questions, and really appreciate your appreciation of the work. It really means a lot.
Thank you, Derek. All right, there it is, Quiller Nation. Love-chaos.com. You can find him, Derek Hunter, and his work at that website, or as he says, find him on Amazon. Well, there it is, Quiller Nation. Another great episode with another fabulous author using historical fiction to further entice a new audience into the Shakespeare authorship mystery. As you all well know, I believe that every avenue of exploration into each and every theory only draws us closer to the ultimate truth. I also know that many of us came to this mystery through one theory or another, only to find ourselves changing our viewpoints. And the more we explore the mystery, our viewpoints sometimes continue to change. My own views on the likely scenarios that could be behind this great mystery have changed drastically over the decades. And even just in the past 7 years of hosting this program, through new questions and stunning revelations brought to us by each new guest. I never run out of amazement at how deep this mystery can go, the angles that can be and are connected to it, the circles of Elizabethan and Jacobean nobility who are attached to so many of the players who must have had a hand in the mystery, its creation, its concealment, its propagation, and its continuation. Sometimes I feel as if we're just now scratching the surface of all there is to learn and know. And I thank you, Quiller Nation, for sharing this journey with me. With each new guest, each new episode, I am ever conscious of your presence. And I hope that as we continue this exploration together, I continue to do it justice by including the Quiller Nation in the pursuit of the truth. I especially want to thank those of you who have become and remain loyal Patreon patrons. And I want to remind the rest of you that you don't have to sign up at a contributing level in order to become a Patreon member. There is a free membership option available at the Patreon site. And I promise you, you won't receive a slew of emails or marketing ploys. That's not our jam. And most of you who know us know that that's the truth. In fact, some of you have been on me recently about the irregularity of our newsletter emails, which I admit I have not been great at producing every month. And a couple of you have admonished me about the slow trickle of content to our various social media channels. So I apologize. I admit I haven't been the best PR guy, but Jake and I have always done our best to keep the episodes coming every 2 weeks. And we're thrilled that listener numbers continue to grow. And that's all thanks to all of you. You have been sharing the podcast with others and providing reviews and ratings at the various streaming sites, and it's working and it's helping grow our Quiller Nation one new listener at a time. So thank you for helping to spread the word. It's working. We see more and more super sleuths joining our ranks every day. And with that, it's now time to name our August Quiller of the Month. As you know, we place the names of each of our Patreon patrons who are registered at the serial Quiller level or above into the computerized wheel of destiny and spin the digital wheel. And this month's prestigious winner is Michael Hannigan. Michael Hannigan. Congratulations, Michael. And watch for producer Jake to send you an email with a special code to use to claim your free item from the Quiller Swag Shop. Thank you for being a loyal serial Quiller. And that does it for this episode, friends. We'll be with you again in 2 weeks with another Quiller episode. And until then, keep asking questions.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, please leave a rating and review in your podcast player. For even more, visit our website, don'tquillthepodcast.com. There you can find official merchandise in our shop, as well as a link to our Patreon. This show is made possible by people like you. We hope you'll consider showing your support by becoming a monthly patron, where you'll receive bonus material and tons of exclusive perks. You can also join in the conversation on our Discord and by following us at Don't Quill the Pod on all social media. All of this can be found at don'tquillthepodcast.com, don'tquillthepodcast.com.
Dragon Wagon.